I am now pleased to introduce the panel that is going to solve all of our problems and tell us exactly what to do with what is ahead of us. I think that what is important from the panel that we're about to hear is that these are folks who are in the work, who are not just helping us generate the data, but are thinking about how to use it and to apply it. And in all seriousness, I'm not looking for answers, I'm looking for ideas. I'm looking to understand what has been tried, what has not been tried, what is making folks curious, courageous, and generating more questions. And for this, I will turn it over to Denise Forte. She is the interim CEO of the Education Trust, and she is going to moderate our panel this afternoon. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. I'm so excited to be here with all of you all today, including our friends that are listening to this or watching this via the streaming. I'm also really excited because I'm sharing the stage with some very, very big experts on these issues. And so I'm just as excited as you all to hear about what they have to say today. We're going to deepen our understanding and hopefully surface some real action items for all of us. And then at the end, I'm going to open it up for questions and also hope to hear some questions from folks that have been streaming this. And I really want to appreciate you up front for asking those questions. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do is have everybody introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Roberto, and then we'll go. Well, actually, let me start with Tom, and then we'll just go down this way.
So I'm Tom Kane. I'm faculty director of the Center for Education Policy Research at Harvard.
Hi, Carrie Wright, former state superintendent from Mississippi.
Good afternoon. I'm Roberto Rodriguez, Assistant Secretary for Policy and Planning at the U.S. Department of Education.
Hello, Alberto Carvalho, Superintendent of LAUSD, formerly of Miami-Dade for 15 years.
Good afternoon. I'm Amy Gadara. I'm the Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
And I'm Scott Marion. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Assessment.
So these are some big hitters, folks. So I'm really excited about this conversation. So let's just start with the first one. My initial question is really just one of reaction. We have seen so much data today, and for the last few months, we've also seen data coming from states and districts. So given all of that, what do we take away from these NAEP results? I'm gonna start with our state experts first. So Amy and Carrie, how do you look at these data? And how do you interpret these NAEP results based on your state's own data? And then I'd love to get Scott into that question as well, to consider these data across multiple states.
Sure, I'll go. So I can't speak to other states, although I've been learning a lot listening to this morning, but I can speak to Virginia. We have been diving into this data since having it last week. And the words we're using are, this is heart-wrenching, this is catastrophic, this is completely game-changing, and we are on the cusp of losing an entire generation of children. And we are taking it very seriously. And I guess the one thing I want to just highlight after taking part in this session today is that in Virginia, and again, I can't speak to others, this COVID is not the reason why we experienced the unbelievably dramatic drops. And let me just say them again, and they give me chills every time I say them out loud. Virginia had the largest drops of any state in the nation on both fourth grade math and fourth grade reading, tied with Maryland for fourth grade math. 3 times the average drop in both those pieces. And that is horrific. Something really bad is happening to have that happen, and something different in Virginia. And what we know is that COVID exacerbated and illuminated the fact that those losses were happening, but they started to happen before the word COVID was even in our language. When we go back and look at the data, we see dramatic drops starting in 2017. So this may be in other places as well, but in Virginia, we are using this NAEP data as a flashlight, not as a hammer, to use a term I used to use a whole lot in my former life, to remind people that what can we learn about what happened before the pandemic happened, and then it became worse during the pandemic, obviously, but this dramatic drop in this. And I'll just very quickly say, we know in Virginia that we took our eyes off of the ball. We know that prior administrations weakened our transparency, they weakened our accountability systems, and lowered expectations. And we know from times 20 years ago that when Virginia and so many other states chose to go the other direction and to raise expectations and strengthen accountability and strengthen transparency, that our system and our schools and our teachers and our students performed and met those high expectations. Unfortunately, we now have evidence of Virginia that when we lower those expectations, we weaken the transparency, we weaken accountability, it's also possible to go in the wrong direction. I'm happy to talk more about what we're going to do with that, but this is an unbelievably somber day in Virginia.
Thank you, Amy. Carrie?
Yeah, I want to just pick up where Amy left off and have a few things to say. This is not a time to lower expectations for children. This is not a time to lower expectations for teachers and leaders. This is a time to keep expectations very high. I'm a firm believer that children will do and can do what you tell them they will do and can do, and provide the support to get them there. So this is not a time to water anything down. This is alarming. Our nation should be, all eyes should be on this in every single state. I can tell you that the first thing that I did was to take a look at our data compared to our statewide data, because I think that's what states should be looking at as well. Does your NAEP data mirror what you're seeing on your statewide assessments? And if not, why not? And if it does, then that's a signal that they're probably, they're probably compatible. For example, Mississippi held its own in reading compared to what it could have happened. And I honestly could attribute that to the fact that we have had a very strong foundation in the science of reading K-3, and that has not stopped. It also, when we look at what happened with us with NAEP, it also, our math drops also mirror our math drops that we also see nationally. So I think that's a part that I think is really, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I think it's very important to keep in line with the fact that NAEP gives you a global picture, but your statewide assessment is really where you have to drill down to individual children, and we'll talk about that as well.
And Scott, what's your takeaway from multiple states?
So we work in about 40 different states, and we've deeply analyzed data from about 20 of them, starting from 2021. We focus more on the state data. Tom's shop has been doing a lot with the interim assessment data. And if you would have asked me to predict ahead of time which states would have fared worse or better, I don't think I would have done that well. Right, on NAEP, except from seeing some of the state data. Because like Carrie said, in many cases it's coherent, but in many cases it's not quite as coherent as we would like, depending on where states. And there's some funny wonky stuff about where you set your cut scores related to the meat of your distribution of kids, that one little change could make a big difference one way or the other. But what we're urging people to do, and what I'm urging people is, I just want to say first, 8th grade math is scary as all get out, right? Because that's such a foundational set of content going into high school math. So that scares me to no end, and that's what I completely echo what Ray said. But what we're urging people to do is NAEP is only at the state level, which is great. It tells policymakers they need to pony up, like Ray said. But then for me to get into districts, schools, kids, I need state data, I need the interim data that Tom's working with to figure out what specific strategies, because it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. And I'll stop.
Alberto, having led both Miami-Dade and now at the helm of LA, I'm sure that you have some insights here. And because LA is a story, what are you seeing in these results?
So I think actually one of the most powerful conclusions with the release of the NAEP data has little to do with education, and it has more to do with the high variability of protocols adopted by different states and districts that does not seem to have led to significantly different academic outcomes. So I hope that this is a precious moment in America where we say, no, we need to stop politicizing that and move on to teaching and learning, period. Because I came from Florida, a very different approach to COVID than California, but singling out Miami-Dade within those states and Los Angeles, Miami-Dade in Florida, Los Angeles in California, they are very, very bright stars in an otherwise very dark landscape of academic performance. So I think the most powerful thing is let's stop talking about those protocols, let's stop talking about the politics of what was done, because it does appear, based on superficial examination of the data, that there were no easy conclusions tying one set of protocols and politics to academic performance. Look, I think in both districts, a number of things are true. Number one, these were districts that pivoted much faster and much more effectively towards a virtual learning environment with much powerful connectivity, attendance, connection, and engagement, one-to-one virtual resources already adopted, LMS systems in place or similar to LMS systems in place, allowing teachers, parents, students to achieve a higher level of engagement that was organized, it was coherent. Secondly, aggressive professional development leading the pandemic, throughout the pandemic, and exiting the pandemic. Effective utilization of federal funds, whether we're talking particularly of ESSER, combined with entitlement programs, Title I, II, III, et cetera, for the purpose of extension of the regular school day, expanded summer school programs targeting, not everybody, but targeting the students who, based on progress monitoring data, required the greatest level of intervention. Using the strategy as far as human resources that work, interventionists and coaches, push in, pull out. And then, of course, speaking for LA, the fact that the district made huge investments in terms of learning packs that were sent home with every single kid. We did not hide. Same thing is true for Miami. If you look at those two districts, very different parts of the country, both in the South, by the way, just different Souths, since there was such concern about the South, outperformed the nation, outperformed in terms of growth or performance, even large cities. The question now is, will my colleagues across the country actually look at this data and rather than simply wanting to do something different for the purpose of attempting a change, look at the data and use the data as a means of asking the question. My district is demographically similar to this district with remarkably parallel percentages of ELL, students with disabilities, black and brown kids, poverty levels, but with vastly different performance levels. So maybe I ought to make that call and ask, what's going on here in your fourth grade reading, math, eighth grade math, or eighth grade reading that is so vastly different from my district when our student populations are so similar? I think therein lies the golden opportunity for America. So let's look at the best practices that the data reveals, and let's stop politicizing education, for obviously the arguments up until now have been proven to be null.
Thank you for that, Alberto. And the thing that I'm going to take away from that is use the data. And so turning to Tom, I'd love to hear from you. You did an analysis a while back looking at some of the states. And how do you interpret that data against what we saw with NAEP this year?
So I'd encourage everybody to look at the magnitude of these losses relative to the effect sizes for the various interventions we have available. Because if you were to do that, you would find these results really startling. So for instance, the loss in Baltimore in eighth grade math is about the same size as the pre-pandemic research implied you would get with providing high dosage tutoring to everybody. Not to 5% or 10% of kids. Like the magnitude of losses in some of these districts is quite large. And so rather than be thinking about incremental things, oh, we're going to do some tutoring, oh, we're going to do some summer school, none of which is designed to solve the problem. We should instead start with the magnitude of the losses in each district and in each state. Look at the evidence on the efficacy of things like high dosage tutoring, but also summer school, after school, double dose math, and et cetera. And put together a program of interventions which, even on paper, is enough to close these gaps. I'm not aware, I haven't seen a single district's plan that if we were to multiply through, okay, what percentage of kids are getting tutors, what percentage of kids are going to summer school, that if you were to do that math, it would add up to the magnitude of the loss that we've seen. And so it's not about sort of having a few programs that are directionally correct but don't add up to the magnitude of the loss that students have suffered. And the sooner we do that, I think the better off students will be.
Thank you. You know, as I looked at the data, probably some of the more troubling points that were lifted up for me was how many of our Black students were doing, how our Latinx students were performing. In particular, when you're looking at some of the districts and states that have been underserving these communities for a very long time. I'm just sort of curious to hear from all of you, how concerned should we be about these results, especially for those groups that have faced systemic barriers in their communities? Scott and Tom, considering the other data that you've seen, Scott, I'll start with you. How concerned should we be?
I mean, extremely concerned. But I think we have to be extremely concerned for everyone, because everyone, we saw with 8th grade math, we saw with a lot of stuff, everyone lost ground. Now, there are kids who will be able to recapture that ground because of resources available to them faster. And so I think, Tom's colleague and our former governing board member, Andrew Ho, and I tease each other about, he likes to use months of learning. And I think the way Tom just characterized these losses in terms of effect size compared to our best science at improving learning is really humbling, because I agree. I don't think it's going to add up. I think we need to think about changing structures. So if we're going to keep trying to pour these interventions into broken structures, they won't last. They won't sustain. And so I think we have to think about, in certain cases, whether it's innovation zones or what it might be. And there are great leaders. We have two great leaders on the panel. I don't know you as well, I'm sorry, and you're new. But these guys have this history of building structures, building a structure of the science and reading in your state from pre-service through in-service, through all sorts of intensive curriculum support, the kind of work that Alberto's done in Miami of building these structures. You have to build structures to sustain these interventions. So we should be really frightened, and for all kids, obviously for the kids who have the least, in the bank already, clearly the need is there.
Tom, what are you seeing in the States?
So NAEP test results aren't just measuring test-taking skills, and they're not just measuring irrelevant academic knowledge. They are leading indicators of the future well-being of our students. And how do we know that? Well, if you look historically, there are a number of states that have seen large increases in NAEP over time. So for instance, North Carolina, a lot of people don't realize this, North Carolina, between 1990 and around 2010, had seen a full 1 standard deviation improvement in achievement. You might say, like, what? Well, what's a standard deviation? Well, that's the increase in North Carolina since 1990 is larger than the black-white achievement gap was in 1990. A whole state moved by that amount over the last 3 decades. But not every state saw increases that large. There were some others that also saw increases, not quite that large. And so what we did was we said, okay, within the states that saw large and small increases, let's compare what happened to the incomes and educational attainment and arrest rates and incarceration rates for the more recent cohorts compared to the older birth cohorts. And do we see any evidence of benefit? Actually, there were substantial increases in improvements in outcomes in the states that had the largest increase on NAEP in the past. So if these 8th grade MAP scores or 8th grade NAEP scores were, if this loss were to become permanent, if there were like an 8-point decline, for students, that would represent about a 1.6% decline in incomes later in life. And you might say, gosh, like what's 1.6%? Well, added up across 48 million kids enrolled in K-12 education, it's almost $1 trillion. That's what it is. And so unless we figure out ways to close these gaps, and we haven't talked about it yet, but fortunately school districts have a lot of resources right now from the federal government to help with this catch up. So unless we use that money to effectively catch up over the next couple of years, there will be dramatic consequences for students.
Okay, that number was really, really big. And when you think of your school district of Proto, that could have a serious impact on the well-being of learners for quite some time. But given what you saw in your district, which has a high proportion of minority students.
So whether we're talking about, again, Los Angeles, and for a little bit of time, forgive me, but I feel that I'm still operating in 2 time zones where the realities are remarkably similar. I'm going to continue to reemphasize that, because we ought to stop looking at the country, north, south, east, west, just look at the best practices wherever they may be and establish the parallels specific to demographic representation. So whether you're talking about Los Angeles currently or Miami-Dade, the overrepresentation of black and brown kids, English language learners, and the higher than national average representation of students with disabilities, it merits a deeper analysis. Whether we look specific to LA back to 2003 or just 2019, we actually see black students, for example, performing better this time around in 2019, and significantly better, consistent with the rest of the large cities over the past 2 decades. By the way, that's not something that you often read in the headlines. You read in the headlines that large cities in America are broken, nothing is happening there. But guess what? The rate of gap closure over the past 2 decades has been studied and restudied, and it is real, it is true, it is true. So there are bright spots, and I think what has worked is exactly the theory of action of building structures, of standardizing progress monitoring tools, of providing before and after school extended learning programs, of adding arts, music, and foreign language to these schools to bring relevance and connection, not just a double dosing in mathematics. There is research. If that's all you do, yes, you'll get short-term bumps, but you get stagnation beyond that. And then, of course, it's doing something that we often don't do. We're doing it in Los Angeles. We did it in Miami, and that helped us entering the pandemic. Parent academies, family academies. Teach the parents how to best support their students at home, provide an echo of learning in the home, and why not? Now that across the country we are more connected than ever before, the student portal can become a parent portal with aggressive coursework that addresses the needs our students are feeling, empower the parent on early identification, engagement, and support for the kids. So again, Los Angeles is an extreme outlier this time around. And I like what you said. I mean, NAEP, one of the most powerful things about NAEP is it gives you a lens into the future. So considering where LA is, despite the circumstances and the difficulties, we're very, very encouraged and very optimistic, notwithstanding the very dark clouds of performance that we've seen across the country. I think that's the power of NAEP.
You translate some of this data for teachers and families, for educators and families?
Well, I think families are really going to be depending a lot on teachers and leaders to do just that. I've often said, parents entrust us with their most prized possessions. Somebody once said that and then said they don't keep the good kids at home. And that is so true. These little ones come to school every single day, and I use little ones meaning K-12. They come to school every single day, and parents are depending on us to do that. And so my advice, even to my team and to the state, is, behind every data point is a face. And if you don't know who that face is, you're missing the boat. Because there is not a one-size-fits-all for African-American children. There's not a one-size-fits-all for students with disabilities. You've got to drill down to that individual child. And that's where your state data and district data really can come to fro. Because that's when teachers and leaders need to be gathering around tables right now, data charts out in front of them, identifying children that are in need of service, because these 8th graders that did so miserably are now in high school. So our time is passing by, and we really need to be drilling down to individual children to see what's going on with them. And most importantly, following that, what help do our teachers need? I mean, our professional development and building the capacity of our teachers is huge, because I think every teacher comes into school every day wanting to do the very best that they can. Every single teacher. But just like all of us, some arrive at these jobs with gifts that others don't have. But that doesn't mean they can't learn those skill sets that they need in order to make sure that they're the best that they could be in front of that classroom. So parents are going to be looking to us. I think parents need to be invited in. I think too often they are not. They need to be invited in, the data shared with parents, and enlist them as a partner. Alberto was talking about the family academies, teaching parents how to be the best advocates, because their children, that's a huge responsibility. When I think about when I let my 2 girls walk into that classroom, that was huge for me as a mom. Like, I'm giving you the people I love more than anything in this whole world, and entrusting you to build their life accordingly. Well, that hasn't changed over time. And so I think parents need to be seen as partners. They need to know the data. They need to know specifically what schools are going to be doing, not just we're going to be working with Carrie in math or we're going to be working with Carrie in reading. No, that's not enough. What does Carrie need in math and what does Carrie need in reading in order to become a better student?
Thank you so much for that. So we have heard a few bright spots, but I want to focus on that a little bit more in this next question. I'm sure the overall picture did not surprise anyone, and the overall takeaway has generally been about the declines in test scores. For me, I was particularly interested, and I really am looking forward to digging in a little bit more about our children with learning differences and our ELL, our second language learners students. I'm going to throw this out to anybody to talk about what some of the bright spots were for you, but I'd love to start with Roberto.
Well, I think, Denise, you mentioned, you had a great question here around, like, what are the implications for our learning gaps? What are the implications for our students that have been traditionally underserved? The implications for all of our students from this data are huge, right? I've been following this data for, over 20 years at the federal level as a policymaker. And the NAEP is such an important barometer of the direction we're going in as a country. We've never seen this magnitude of a drop, particularly in 8th grade mathematics. It is jarring, it is sobering, it is deeply disturbing, right? And we can look at some of this data. We'll look at our English learners data. I'd be very interested to hear from our other panelists around that. We know that some of our students that may not have been able to have been redesignated in our English learner subgroup might still be in this data. So perhaps that's part of what we're seeing in terms of some progress there. But the reality is we need to do much better, as a country, for all of our subgroups, all of our populations here that are contained in the NAEP. And I think, let's be clear, these results, I think, are a clarion call for us to double down on the instructional core. Right? What are we doing with respect to teaching, learning, supporting and scaffolding those skills and that knowledge for our teachers, engaging our parents as full partners in that data and in those strategies? We know that over half of our districts are engaged in high dosage tutoring and other tutoring to support their student learning, right? As part of this acceleration, we've invested $130 billion in ESSER, thanks to the support of Congress, to really help move that forward. But we have to take a look at what's working out there, the evidence base. We know what works here, right? We know that if we have individualized, tailored instruction, we have opportunities to utilize formative and diagnostic tools to help see where students are and help them move forward. Look at that data in an effective manner, in a systemic manner. Improve the skills and knowledge and supports for our teachers, our instructional personnel. We know that we can turn the tide here, but we have to be able to do that at scale. That is the charge, and I think that's a charge for our students with disabilities and for our English learners, just as it is with all of our students.
Thank you. I think scale is very important in this conversation. Scott, what about the bright spots for you?
I'm usually an optimist, but I'm having trouble with bright spots, and just because it's not like 2019 was a great year, right? We have still such a long way to go in terms. Tom mentioned the achievement gaps earlier, right? And your organization is designed to advocate for doing something about that. So and the other thing I just want to say, why I'm not just jumping at bright spots, is I've been writing a lot the last couple of weeks about not sort of chasing just so stories, right? Like, I see some data, let me make up a story to explain it, in the best of intentions, right? Because we do that, we naturally do that. So the advantage we have with this NAEP is the link to get into the data, to the school pulse survey and other forms of data, to allow us to really try to unpack this and learn where there were some good things happening and try to explain it, but go in with some hypotheses. I know I'm not sounding that fun, but to think about some hypotheses ahead and then test them with the data as opposed to looking at the data and trying to find where things are. This is complex, and we always joke in our field that if you have one watch, you always know what time it is. If you have two, you're never quite sure. That was a better joke before iPhones, but it was. But the reality is, we have a lot of watches right now, and it's to try to figure out. But we do have this rich data source that we're just all starting to dig into. So I think we'll find bright spots, but I think we have to look at them in a disciplined way and look for them, and to really, instead of just sort of latching on to something that looks good.
Anyone else want to jump in on the bright spots? Yeah, Tom.
Well, I'm not sure I describe it as a bright spot as much as like a glaring inconsistency. And that is, if you pair these results that we've been talking about today with parent surveys, 90% or more of parents seem to think their child is currently on grade level, despite the pandemic. Now, partially, I'm not blaming parents. Partially, I think that's based on the information that they have available to them. When you think about it, like what's the main thing parents see? They see whether their kid is happy going off to school, if their kid is happy coming back from school, and what their grades are. What we're seeing today is that, okay, all that may be fine or is getting back to normal, but kids are not covering the material that they're supposed to be covering in their current grade. And it's up to school leaders, starting with teachers, but also to superintendents, to state commissioners, need to be honest with parents about where we are. Because if they're not, and actually I think there are a lot of commissioners and superintendents who have not been honest, who are focusing more on, okay, what's the bounce back since 2021, when you realize, wait a minute, the pandemic didn't start in 2021. We should be comparing where we are relative to 2019, and there are a lot of districts who are way behind where they were in 2019. And here's why that's so critical, to be honest with parents about where kids are in terms of the content for their grade. And that is, it's going to be really hard to ask for the hard things that we're going to need to do if parents seem to think everything's fine. So, for instance, if I know Superintendent Carvalho was seeking increases, extending the school year this year. I actually have a hard time seeing some districts, not necessarily LAUSD, but some of the districts with much larger losses in the data. I have a hard time seeing an increase, seeing them bounce back enough without doing things like extending the school year or using school vacation academies. And yet, if parents think everything's fine, it's going to be almost impossible to ask for that kind of change. And so I would just call on all of our leaders to be much more honest with parents about where things stand now in terms of kids being up to date with their current grade standards. And if we do that, we can start to build much more of a sense of ownership on this recovery effort that we need to get going in the next couple of years.
Can we extend the honesty to state legislatures too?
Yes. Amen.
Can I just say one thing? You know, this, and this, I know preaching to the choir, but this is hard work. This is not a simple fix. This is not going back and doing the same thing we've done over and over and over again and expecting a different outcome. This is really re-examining what we're doing inside the school day. You know, how much time is really being spent teaching? How much time is being spent on reading? How much time is being spent on mathematics? How much time is being spent providing the professional development that our teachers need in order to utilize that time well? This is, if any of us up here could be multimillionaires if we had the silver bullet, right? But there is no silver bullet to students learning. It is hard work, it is day in and it is day out, and it is sticking to it regardless of how hard it gets. And it is making sure, that's what our teachers do every single day, and our leaders do every single day. But we've also got to make students wanting to come to our classrooms, wanting them to feel like they're welcome, wanting them to feel that they're included. But this part of it, this is the beginning of a large journey, but I don't want people to walk away thinking that this is going to be done in a matter of time. This is over the long haul.
Absolutely. You are preaching to the choir, but I've been saying for a long time now that this pandemic was not 1 or 2 years. It's going to be long-lasting. Alberto?
She actually just made one of my points. I mean, my near obsession with shining a light on, jurisdictions where something unnatural happened is twofold. Number one is because if you're holding the torch, be proud. Secondly, I think this year's release of NAEP data speaks to resiliency. You just said it. It's hard work. There are no silver bullets. And teachers and principals and support staff made it happen. So why? Why is it in certain communities we saw an aggressive bucking of the trend? And with that said, what was stated previously is absolutely right. Let's go before 2019. There was nothing really great happening. Yes, you still had pretty much the same outliers in terms of performance, but woefully low percentage of students performing above basic. And that's where we need to actually pay closer attention to. Yes, these bumps in certain districts are important, but I don't think that both realities are mutually exclusive. I celebrate LA, I celebrate Miami, but I also recognize that the percentage of students who are not making it in these two same districts is unacceptable. With that said, something is happening there, and kudos to our teachers. That despite the challenges, despite the accusations, I mean, they came in as heroes, and then people sort of turned on them and called them zeros because of nothing more, nothing less than adopted policies in different parts of the country. No, they are heroes, as are the custodial staff and all the folks who made this happen. But I think maintaining that dual reality of truth. There are hot spots, there are bright spots in the country that we ought to look for the best practices. What are the organized structures and systems that were put into place? How well are these parent academies working? What is your professional development like? How are you really leveraging the power of connectivity and digital content? Are you striking it aggressively in terms of identifying the students who really need the high dosage tutoring? I was not happy when I first arrived in LA. 10% of those kids were getting services. We boosted it to 20% in just a matter of months. Something is working. So, but the two realities are not mutually exclusive. You can celebrate bright spots across the country for the sake of identification of best practices that can be replicated and amplified, while at the same time not losing track of the fact that an exceedingly high percentage of students are not even performing at basic level NAEP, no matter what your growth or what your static performance is.
Amy, I know you wanted
yeah,
to get it.
I would, thank you. So I'd like to build on several of the comments that have been made the last two rounds. One is there isn't any silver bullet in education, but we cannot get out of this hole that we're in right now without using information in a different way. And I just want to make 2 points on this. One is, to what Tom was saying, we have a huge issue in Virginia that we have been telling not only parents, but taxpayers, teachers, everyone, that everything is okay. I mentioned before our accreditation system, which is really another name for an accountability system that's non-existent. And we just announced that 89% of our schools are fully accredited, and we have no schools in Virginia that are not accredited. So just pause for a second and remember the data that you saw in Virginia, and you tell me how much honesty that we are providing to the people of Virginia. To a normal person, you say 89% of our schools are accredited, and all of our schools are accredited. You think everything's hunky-dory, like I'm gonna go move to Virginia. And it's not. And so part of this is about how do we use information and data, and this is why I am the greatest cheerleader for NAEP, is because this use of data as a flashlight to focus on what's working, what's not working, where we need to prioritize our resources and our energy and our time and our money, is because we do that. And in places where you put that light under a basket, like in Virginia, where we have not used data in a way to empower people, to inform people, and to improve, guess what? We've got lousy results. And so one of the things I am most excited about, and my bright spot, I hope, using the light analogy, is that this today, this somber, terrible day for Virginia, will actually be a wake-up call that people realize we need to look at what's going on, and we need to change what we're doing and use data to do that. And one of the things I am most excited about that the governor, we started today with an event in Richmond at 8 o'clock, and one of the things that the governor redoubled down on is something that we launched over the summer, because we knew this was going to be our data. We're not surprised at all about this, because we had data that had never been shared before with Virginians that said 42% of our second graders are not on track to read independently by third grade. That's a death knell. We knew from our state scores that we released in May that we had really terrible declines. We knew our ACT scores, so the data kept coming, so we weren't surprised at all. We were shocked at how bad it was, but it was not bad. So we've been thinking about this since day one in office, and one of the things that we rolled out this summer is called the Bridging the Gap Initiative. And the thing I think is transformative is we are making a commitment, and today we announced that we're going to expedite this, to provide every student, every parent, and every teacher a snapshot of all of the data points we have collected on them, on students at the local and state level, and provide basically a story of where is this child, where is this youth at this moment. And for any and every student, and the key there is to what several of the panelists said is, how do you then change that conversation? Right now, the number one thing we hear from teachers is they don't have access to information in a manageable way, in an actionable way that they know what to do with it. And if anyone hasn't looked at the Learning Heroes research that Tom referenced, please go look at it. This is a moment to double down on this, right? This story about parents thinking everything's okay, teachers knowing it's not, no one's having the conversation. We're trying to change that in Virginia by providing the three critical pieces. I taught in Japan for a year. Number one thing I learned, Japanese education thinks about education as being balanced on a three-legged stool. You need the parent, the student, and the teacher working together. And if one of those legs is wobbly, the other two need to compensate and work together in partnership. That's the moment that Carrie's talking about. How do we change this conversation and use information and see every child, and then say, how are we going to make sure that we are meeting every child where he or she is and getting them where they need to go? The only way you can do that is if you have everyone's looking at the same data points and then saying, so what does this tell us? Now, what are we going to do differently, and how are we going to do this together? And so what we're doing is providing this data set, this picture of what's going on. And for every student who is not on track for success, and it turns out in Virginia, that's going to be a lot of them, we are also going to create a personalized learning plan that the teacher, the student, and the parent will work together so it's a constructive conversation. And we're going to provide training for our educators to know how to have the hard conversations with both students and their parents about how do we do this in a constructive way so that remember what we're focusing on is getting every child to be on track for success in life. So again, to me, this is about how do we change the role of information, and we need data at all data points. This NAEP data is so important for shining a light and waking us up to what's not working, but that we need that longitudinal data, that student level information that can really allow us to pinpoint and make changes in individual children's lives. So that's the bright point. I hope today marks a whole culture change in how we use information.
That's a powerful way to help us almost close out this session. We only have a couple minutes left. and I'm going to start with Roberto because he wanted to get in on the last question. But before we open it up to the floor and also our folks who are streaming in right now, if we were to reconvene next year, what would we want to see happen? What would be the thing we'd want to talk about, both then and into the future? And I'll start with Roberto.
Well, I would love to see us as a country marshal the time, the attention, and the resources in a more focused way on the academic progress that we need to see for all of our students. Right? That is our charge here. It is absolutely using the data and getting to an even deeper level of data that's useful at the classroom level and for our teachers. That's certainly true. But let's remember that we have an evidence base around what works here. Like, we know how to improve the instructional core. It is hard work, right, as has been said. We know we need partners alongside our teachers and our students in making sure that they can get the progress made. But we know what works in engaging parents, right? But we have to focus our policies and our systems more intentionally on that evidence base. So I would love to see that level of focus. And that doesn't mean that the federal government has to prescribe a one-size-fits-all approach to get there. It does mean we have a role to play around aggregating and supporting that evidence base. And this is why we've been focused on this from day one, in providing handbooks for our field to help support this. We're going to be kicking off another series focused on academic recovery on Wednesday, to really bring together some of that expertise and provide that opportunity for the entire country to learn from that. But that is the effort that we need in the moment that we're in. And we have, what brings me optimism, the stories and the examples that we are seeing, the living proof, the testaments of that hard work in play in districts and states around the country. NAEP is an important snapshot. And then as you travel around the country, we are seeing tremendous examples of putting into practice that evidence base and students catching up and students accelerating. That should give us all optimism and hope. The other thing that should give us optimism and hope is that we have resources in the system in a way we never have before to get this work done. There's $130 billion in ESSER dollars that are available today. We worked expeditiously with states to get those dollars out. Our districts have shaped plans around those dollars. We know that at least 27 billion of those dollars from independent sources have said that that's going to be focused on academic recovery. My question today is that enough? Can we ask every district to go back and look at their budgets and their time and their policies and their attention on this challenge and say, what more do we need to do with the resources that we have now to really accelerate our progress, to up our game on behalf of our students over the next couple of years?
Thank you, Roberto. I'm going to turn to the audience for questions. Our in-person audience. Okay, over here.
Paulo Di Maria from the National Association of State Boards of Education. Great panel. Dr. Carvalho, I love what you say about best practices, and I think they're academic best practices, but also change management best practices. I think, to the gentleman's point, we know what different looks like, but we have a hard time actually making change. You have done a pretty good job, a very good job, of effectuating change. What are some of your secrets in terms of approaching the adults in the system to drive changes in adult behavior that ultimately lead to changes in classroom behavior to make the kind of differences that we're seeing today?
Yeah, I think we actually as a country know exactly what it takes to teach kids how to read, compute, write. It's no longer a skill set deficit, it's a will set proposition. It's a lack of political courage to do that which is proven to be right, and it always works. But often adult circumstances, pronouncements, politics get in the way of us doing the right thing for kids. What I think has worked is fairly simple. There are 5 things that I've identified. Number 1, having structures and systems that provide homogeneous understanding of what the data reveals and the best practices that it informs. That homogeneous, standardized, whether it's progress monitoring tools, periodic assessments, can then use to provide differentiated support and funding. I don't believe in funding every single kid at the same level, and the districts that I've led, we differentiate significantly, funding on a basis of circumstance, on a basis of performance and needed assistance. professional development that is also tied to that differentiated data profile. Earned autonomy models for schools, meaning, you get independent control of your finances and even curricular decisions to the extent the performance reveals that you are in full control producing results that make sense. Otherwise, you get much more directed support and accountability. Establishing systems within systems. So whether it was Miami, ETO, Educational Transformation Office, or LA, Data Dig, the 100 most fragile schools with the most fragile populations. I know if I move that 10% of students, 10% of schools, the system will jump. Make those schools accountable to me, which they are. If they succeed, I succeed. If they don't succeed, I should not deserve to stay in my job. Leverage the power of parents through data, parent academies, family academies. Elevate the best-in-class teachers, don't take them out of the classroom, pay them more, incentivize them more to be in-school coaches and interventionists. Don't create pathways where a teacher to earn more money leaves the classroom. Do the same thing for assistant principals and principals. Leverage lattice leadership opportunities to keep the best in class in the classroom or in the school. And then the last one comes right out of Lincoln. Paint the picture, tell a story. We are lousy as educators in terms of painting the picture and telling the story about what works.
Wonderful. Can I get a question from the streaming audience?
Yes. Thank you for asking. I have here from Gabriela Burma from Beyond Basics. Systemic change takes time. How can we ensure high school students who have less time to catch up receive the diagnostic-driven, individualized daily literacy intervention they need now so that they graduate with skills and confidence able to pursue every college and career opportunity?
Either Carrie or Amy want to take that question? I'm sorry.
Apologize. I have this world's worst cold. I'm just coming off of it. One thing that I think high schools could do, and I know some of our high schools in Mississippi have done this, they've totally re-examined the high school day, and in order to make the most of the day. It's not just a 4x4, 7-period day, 8-period day, whatever it is. They've literally looked at every minute of the day, at every person of the day, in order to build in extra time for students who need the help the most inside that student day, so they're not being penalized by having to come after school and not being able to participate in sports. So it happens during the day. But that took a whole high school coming together and all agreeing that there were children in the school that needed more help than they were getting beyond the regular day. So they still have their same periods, but on those times that they are creating those intervention periods, these high schools have done it so they've been so successful, particularly in this one district, that the middle schools now want to take a look at re-examining their schedules. So that's what I'm saying about we have to look at things to be done differently. You can't just keep the same thing and expect the same, a different kind of an outcome. And that took a lot of courage for high schools. For those of you that know our high school friends, they're pretty good about that regimen around that schedule. But it took a lot of courage for those high schools to do that. And now those individual children are getting the help that they need inside the school day.
And I'll just add quickly onto that, with a shout out to Carrie and the leadership that she showed around literacy across the nation, and another shout out to the value of NAEP, right? The world was watching what Mississippi did because they looked at their NAEP scores and said something awesome is happening there. That's what we did in Virginia. We knew we had a crisis in literacy, and so we passed our bipartisan Virginia Literacy Act based on what Mississippi did, and we're hoping someone then comes on top and builds it on top of ours. But the bottom line is it's a yes and answer to the question from online. We need to focus on what we're doing with literacy is we're putting $70 million into retraining teachers to doing interventions with students of all ages, prioritizing how we change our schools of education, soup to nuts, including how do we catch up students in high school and focus on the science of reading as a focus of helping students at all levels. But it's a yes and. It's also, we can't just keep doing things the way we do it in education. So one of the things that Governor Youngkin has launched in his piece is this lab school approach, which is basically about bringing innovation and choice throughout the Commonwealth and changing how we provide multiple pathways, that not a one-size-fits-all to education, but think thinking about how do we meet students where they are, how do we break down the walls between schools and the world beyond them, especially with employers. And we think that that will get much better results in addressing skills as well and skill development when we're bringing people with students into the community and the community into schools as well.
This has been such an interesting conversation for me. I'm so appreciative of everybody on stage. I'm appreciative of those out in the audience and those out in the streaming world. And if one thing that's the big takeaway is, let's not be afraid of the data. This data is really showing us something very serious, and it is a clarion call. And I'd love to have Dr. Matthews come up back on stage to join us.
A well-deserved round of applause for our moderator and all of our panelists. Thank you all for joining us today for NAEP Day 2022, and keeping in mind that NAEP Day is a metaphor. Let every day be a NAEP Day where you're looking at data. Please explore the full 2022 NAEP math and reading results at nationsreportcard.gov. A recording of this panel, of the entire day, will be posted at nagb.gov as well. And then it says, insert parting words of hope and promise here. And so for that, I would say that as we pull all of this together, I invite us all into a space of what I call the art of constructive wrangling. The National Assessment Governing Board and the National Center for Education Statistics work through this every day. There's always wrangling. There's always push and pull. There's always the kind of tension that comes with authenticity when it comes to addressing what is happening in our education systems. And I would encourage us to resist the temptation of lowering the bar. Instead of lowering the bar, we could take this moment to believe in higher horizons. Resist the urge to point fingers. Instead, we can pick levers. We can look at our neighbors and see what is being done and learn to use from that. And above all, do not guess. Ask good questions and use good data. Interrogate good data. Adopt practices informed by good data so that you can generate more good data, rinse and repeat. As we honor the whole child, as we come into this space of thinking about the whole child and the whole educator, this is an opportunity for us to acknowledge that we are a whole nation. And the results show what many of us have always known, that the choice before us is about all or none. $1 trillion impact predicted by these scores is GDP changing impact. This is all or none. This is not a zero-sum game. This is not a time for scarcity mindsets. This is not a time to fear authenticity or asking for what we actually need. It is an opportunity to acknowledge that we can choose all. That is the choice that I will make, and I encourage us all to do the same. Please have a wonderful day.